Hello, BookTube. A little while ago, David Wiley over on his channel inaugurated a kind of video template called Bookshelf Essentials, where you look at all the books on your shelf and you look at all the three-headed monsters and the unwanted cousins and the dead make-weight that you scooped up at some library sale and you haven't touched in 8 years, or whatever. But lodged among those will be your essentials, will be the books that you really, really love, that you really care about. It's been my experience that most book people, all book people have that differentiation. Your eyes are always bigger than your stomach when it comes to hoovering up books. But it's been my experience that most book people, once they have a collection over a couple of hundred books, they'll segregate roughly what counts as their bookshelf essentials from their other books. I know some booktubers don't do that. I can guess that some booktubers don't do that because I can look at their library over their shoulder and just make that guess. I think I'm probably right. But I think a lot of people do that. I certainly do that. So a lot of my bookshelf essentials are in the little book room that I have, as opposed to everywhere else in Hyde Cottage. Everywhere else in Hyde Cottage is covered in bookshelves. It's amazing there's not a bookshelf right behind me. There could be. It's amazing that there's not. It's just that the fainting couch fits so perfectly in this little corner that I haven't bothered to do it otherwise. But most of mine are in the little book room, so I'm mining that. I've been wandering around for bookshelf essentials. I want to do a whole bunch of bookshelf essentials in 2024. I've been looking around in the other parts of Hyde Cottage, but I mostly end up in there. And today, as you know, since I'm sure I will put this in the video's title, today is a big one. Today is, we did a bookshelf essential for Moby Dick. And I suggested that it was almost certainly the great American novel of the 19th century. I love the concept of a great American novel. I love that concept. It's always fun to play around with. But I think even with a minimal amount of fairness, it needs to be restricted to centuries. If we're going to call Moby Dick the great American novel of the 19th century, then I think the title of the great Russian novel of the 19th century goes to War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. 1869 is when this appeared as a book. Tolstoy wrote it and rewrote it and redrafted it and pizzled with it and fudged around with it and serialized it in a million different ways. The textual history on this book is mind-boggling, just mind-boggling. And I want you to keep in mind, I want you to keep in mind, no blue-haired fifth-wave feminism here, but I want you to keep in mind that mind-boggling textual histories, 80 million drafts, some portions drafted 10 times, 15 times, some drafted not at all, but not fitting with the other drafts, some made ready for typeface, some made proof and clean so that they could be serialized, all the rest of it made proof and clean so it could be put in a novel form. All that was done by Tolstoy's wife, in longhand. Her name ought to be on the cover of every edition of War and Peace. Without her, literally, we would not have this book. But this is huge, of course. War and Peace is known for its length. It's known for its greatness. The Tolstoy is one of a very rare company of writers, very annoying company of writers who wrote 2 great books. Almost never happens. Of course, it almost never happens that any writer ever writes a great book. But every once in a while in history, you will get a writer who writes not only a great book, but 2 great books. Very annoying. Homer, of course. But there's also Tolstoy. He wrote War and Peace, and he wrote Anna Karenina. And this is the story of Napoleon's doomed invasion of Russia. It isn't that story, but without that story, none of this would happen. That is the war part of War and Peace. Napoleon Bonaparte decides to invade Russia. It didn't make any sense for him to make that decision. The plans he made did not make any sense. I won't go into a whole tirade about the pestiferous little Corsican, but his invasion of Russia is just another brick in the wall of the portrait of a very bad military leader. I don't know why Bonaparte has this enormous, centuries-long reputation as a brilliant military leader. almost every military action that he did, all the way from Egypt and the Sudan to Moscow, was an abysmal failure. And not a failure for happenstance beyond his control, but a failure because of items that he could have anticipated, that he should have anticipated, that he was told to anticipate. Needless to say, his invasion of Russia was a fiasco. But it was a bloody fiasco and a big upheaval for Russian society, for Tsar society at the time. And that is the substance of this book, is Tolstoy looking at a vast, interconnected web of Russian characters and showing how their lives will be smashed or pulled out of shape by this event. And it's ungainly, and it shifts in tone wildly sometimes from chapter to chapter, from character to character, sometimes not from character to character. And it also injects a lot of bloviating. There's a lot of philosophical bloviating about the nature of history and the nature of inquiry and whatnot, including, fatally, it should be fatal, the whole last 50 pages of the book. The admixture of all of those things is such a combination of delirious creativity and incredible self-indulgence that it shouldn't work. And yet, it does. It does. Now, I know that there are 80 million Frenchmen out there who tell me that the same thing works in the same combination for Proust. I haven't been able to see it in Proust, but I definitely see it in Tolstoy. Definitely. And that's weird, because I can read Proust without a translator in the equation, and I can't read Tolstoy, except in translation. And yet, boy, oh boy, does this book work on me. Oh boy, does it ever. I know there's a dichotomy there between fans of War and Peace and fans of Anna Karenina. Anna Karenina is a far more controlled book. Far more controlled. And in some ways, far more powerful. It might be that, like the Iliad, War and Peace is simply too powerful. So its effect can't help but be diffused when you're reading it. It's possible that I've never known anyone, for instance, when you read Anna Karenina, or when you read, for instance, The Odyssey, you come away with a personal reaction, a moved reaction to the whole thing, to the whole story. When you read the Iliad, you do not do that. You come away with glowing shards of shrapnel in you, in your brain, but not the whole thing. And the same thing with War and Peace. You come away with, there'll be chunks of this, characters in this, scenes in this, that will be the glowing shrapnel in your brain. But the whole fabric of it, no. Maybe because it's just too much. But I think it's wonderful. Gloriously enveloping. Oh, my. Oh, my. But, like I mentioned, I have only ever encountered this book in English language translation. And I bet that's true for a lot of you. So I thought we'd have a little fun with that during this Bookshelf Essential. There's no rules for Bookshelf Essential. I have often told you, when we're talking about a book in translation over the years, over the many, many years that you've had me droning in your ear about books, I've mentioned that if you are a monoglot reader, let's say a monoglot English reader, I'd be willing, I don't know how to look at the analytics on my YouTube, but I'd be willing to bet that 90% of the people who watch me are monoglot English readers. So you read English, but you don't read any other language. If that, I have often said, if that is true, and you are approaching a work in translation, especially a huge work in translation, 1,500 pages, far more important to you than the critical evaluations of whatever translation you're considering is the personal resonance of that translation. Does that translation work for you? If that translation doesn't work for you, then it absolutely does not matter whether or not a consensus of critics has called it the best translation of them all. It can't possibly matter. If it doesn't work for you, you're not going to read the book. You're not going to read that translation. So how the translation gets along with you is all important. It's all important. Far more important than how accurate the translation is, far more important than how esteemed the translation is. It's got to work for you or you won't read it at all. If you pick up a bad translation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or The Three Musketeers, two books that are notorious for having very popular bad translations. If you pick up a bad translation of those books and it works for you, well, then you'll read all the way to the end and you'll fall in love with the book, and that love will be the basis, the rock-solid foundation from which you can go and explore other translations. You'll eventually learn the ins and outs of the translations, and maybe there'll be another one that'll come along that's far more accurate that you will like a lot more. I bet if that happens, you'll still have a soft spot for the bad translation you read first that introduced you to the wonder of this author who's now indispensable to you. But that obviously comes first. No matter what ostentatiously blue-eyed grifters you may encounter on BookTube or off BookTube who assume a moved tone of voice and tell you which translation will move you the most. But not in this video. You have to pay for that on my Patreon. Despite those people, that is a very top-down pedagogical view of this. I will tell you which translation is the one to use. Despite how prevalent that attitude is, nothing can change whether or not a translator works for you or doesn't. They're either going to work with you or they aren't, depending on the decisions that they make. And that comes before anything else. It certainly comes before the snobbery of anybody who wants to teach you. As I say many times on this channel, I'm here to talk, not to teach. So I thought it'd be fun to look at different translations of the opening of War and Peace. Right here in this video, I always tell you, go to your library, go to your bookstore, and consult as many translations side by side as you can. But why not do this on this video? So this is the Old Penguin Classics. This is the Rosemary Edmonds translation, a very battered mass market paperback of mine. We're going to go to the very beginning of this book. The beginning of chapter 1. It's going to take some page turning here and read how this book begins. It begins with a soiree, a ball, being held in Russian imperial society where you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a princess or a prince. And they're all in various stages of proximity to the very top of the imperial pinnacle, to the empress and the emperor. One of the members of that unbelievably extended gentility, which is the rock that is Napoleon is headed straight for their world. One of those members throws a ball, and we get an opening scene. Now, I'm not going to read. I'll have to decide on a cutoff point, but to get all the way to part 2 of part 1 is a little bit long. We'll see how far we go. We don't have to read much because we've got a lot to go through here. I'm sure there'll be a natural stopping point. This is how the Rosemary Edmonds translation of War and Peace begins. Eh bien, mon prince. So Genoa and Lucca are now no more than private estates of the Bonaparte family. No, I warn you, if you are not telling me that this means war, if you again allow yourself to condone all the infamies and atrocities perpetrated by that Antichrist, upon my word, I believe he is the Antichrist. I don't know you in the future. You will no longer be a friend of mine, or my faithful slave, as you call yourself. But how do you? How do you? See, I'm scaring you. Sit down and talk to me. We start not only in French, the greeting is in French, but also with conversation. It was on a July evening in 1805, and the speaker was the well-known Anna Pavlovna Scherer, maid of honor and confidant to Empress Maria Fedorova. With these words, she greeted the influential statesman Prince Vasily, who was the first to arrive at her soiree. Anna Pavlovna had been coughing for some days. She was suffering from an attack of la grippe, as she said, grip being a new word only used by a few people. She has la grippe, the wheezing and the sneezing. Never mind. We won't go into Broadway musicals. But in 1805, Tolstoy is telling us that was a new term. That morning, a footman in scarlet livery had delivered a number of little notes, all written in French and couched in the same terms. And here are the terms. If you have nothing better to do, Count or Prince, and if the prospect of spending an evening with a poor invalid is not too alarming, I shall be charmed to see you at my house between 7 and 10. Signed, Annette Scherer. Mercy on us, what a violent attack, replied the prince, as he came forward in his embroidered court uniform with silk stockings and buckled shoes. He wore orders on his breast, with an expression of serenity on his flat face. He was not in the least disconcerted by such a reception. He spoke in the elegant French in which our forefathers not only spoke, but also thought. And his voice had the quiet, patronizing intonations of a distinguished man who has spent a long life in society and at court. He went up to Anna Pavlovna, kissed her hand, presented her his view, to her view his perfumed, shining, bald head, and complacently seated himself on the sofa. "First of all, cher ami, tell me how you are. Set my mind at rest," said he, with no change of voice or tone, in which indifference and even irony were perceptible beneath the conventional sympathy. "How can one feel well when one's moral sensibilities are suffering? Can anyone possessed of any feeling remain tranquil in these days?" said Anna Pavlovna. "You are staying the whole evening, I hope." "What about the party at the English ambassador's? Today is Wednesday. I must put in an appearance there," said the prince. "My daughter is coming to fetch me." "I thought it had been put off. I must say, all these fetes and fireworks displays are beginning to pall." "If they had known that it was your wish, the party would have been put off," replied the prince mechanically, like a watch that has been wound up, saying things he did not even wish to be believed. "Don't tease me. Well, what has been decided on in regard to Novosiltsov's dispatch? You know everything." She wants to pump the prince for information. Sorry to stumble on the Russian words. How many times I've read this? These people still have the rudeness not to be called Flanagan and O'Brien. Prince Vasily always spoke languidly, like an actor repeating his part in an old play. Anna Pavlovna Scherer, on the contrary, in spite of her 40 years, was brimming over with vivacity and impulsiveness. To be enthusiastic had become her pose in society, and at times, even when she did not feel very like it, she worked herself up to the proper pitch of enthusiasm in order not to disappoint the expectations of those who knew her. The affected smile, which constantly played round her lips, though it did not suit her faded looks, expressed her consciousness of having an amiable weakness which, like a spoilt child, she never wished, nor could, nor considered it necessary to correct. Okay, we'll stop there, because that's a lot, and we have a lot to go through. But notice what, I don't want to oversell, but a huge amount has been done in just these few paragraphs. We know Prince Vasily completely. In just a few brushstrokes, we know him completely. We know Anna Pavlovna Scherer. Sure, we know her completely. We know what both of them are like. It's so effortlessly done. Again, not to over-egg the pudding, but it does remind you of Homer, who in violent battle scenes, when he's introducing the next pigeon that Diomedes is going to behead, describes them in a few lines, and suddenly you know everything about them, or you feel like you do. So Rosemary Edmonds, through translating Tolstoy, has conveyed this opening scene, which is a glittering soiree. Princes and counts are there. They are discussing the news of the day, and look at all that we get. We get this decadent world in which these two people are putting on facades. They don't believe what they're saying. They don't believe how they're saying it. They're pumping each other for information, and it's all about the Antichrist. Makes his appearance right away. So that's how Rosemary Edmonds translates that opening part. Now let's move on to a different translation. This one is also old. This is Constance Garnett. This is my hardcover. Yours won't look like this, but this is an old Book of the Month Club thing that had hideous covers for War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and I just fixed them. So we're going to read Constance Garnett's translation of that same passage. "Well, Prince, Genoa and Lucca are now no more than private estates of the Bonaparte family." Notice any hint of French is gone from that opening. This great Russian novel, does not start in French in Constance Garnett's translation. "No, I warn you that if you do not tell me that we are at war, if you again allow yourself to palliate all the infamies and atrocities of this Antichrist, upon my word I believe he is, I don't know you in the future. You are no longer my friend, no longer my faithful slave, as you say. There, how do you do? How do you do? I see I'm scaring you. Sit down and talk to me." These words were uttered in July 1805 by Anna Pavlovna Scherer, I'm still going to get the names wrong, a distinguished lady of the court and confidential maid of honor to the Empress Maria Fyodorova. It was her greeting to Prince Vasily, a man high in rank and office, who was the first to arrive at her soiree. Anna Pavlovna had been coughing for the last few days. She had an attack of la grippe, la post-nasal drip, with the wheezing and the sneezing. As she said, grip was then a new word only used by a few people. In the notes she had sent round in the morning by a footman in red livery, she had written to all indiscriminately, "If you have nothing better to do, Count or Prince, It's prince that's first in the other translation, and count that's in parentheses. Here, count is first and prince is in parentheses. And if the prospect of spending an evening with a poor invalid is not too alarming to you, I shall be charmed to see you at my house between 7 and 10. Signed, Annette Scherer. Heavens, what a violent outburst, the prince responded, not in the least disconcerted at such reception. He was wearing an embroidered court uniform, stockings and slippers, and had stars on his breast and a bright smile on his flat face. Earlier translation had it as he had orders on his breast, which means military decorations, but you might not know that. You've never heard the word used that way, so you might not know that. It might throw you. What does that mean? He's got orders on his breast? Here, it's clear. He spoke in that elaborately choice French in which our forefathers not only spoke, but thought, with those slow, patronizing intonations peculiar to a man of importance who had grown old in court society. He went up to Anna Pavlovna, kissed her hand, presenting her with a view of his perfumed, shining, bald head, and complacently settled himself on the sofa. First of all, tell me how you are, dear friend. Relieve a friend's anxiety, he said, with no change in his voice or tone, in which indifference and even irony was perceptible through the veil of courtesy and sympathy. How can one be well when one is in moral suffering? How can one help being worried in these times if one has any feeling? Said Anna Pavlovna. You spend the whole evening with me, I hope. And the fete at the English ambassador's? Today is Wednesday. I must put in an appearance there, said the prince. My daughter is coming to fetch me and take me there. I thought 2 days' fete had been put off. I confess that all these festivities and fireworks are beginning to pall. If they had known that it was your wish, the fete would have been put off, said the prince, from habit, like a wound-up clock, saying things he did not even wish to be believed. Don't tease me. Well, what has been decided in regard to the Novositsilov? Siltsov? Novosiltsov? Novotsilov? To the O'Brien dispatch. You know everything. What is there to tell, said the prince in a tired, listless tone. What has been decided? It has been decided that Bonaparte has burnt his ships, and I think that we are about to burn ours. So the prince has ominous news. He's very blasé because he's been saying these doesn't mean for a long time. But what did you think of that compared to the other? They are very similar. They are trying to do something very similar. They're doing it slightly different ways. One might appeal to you a little more than the other. They're close enough so that if you only had a choice between one, you might pick it over the other. But they're both trying to do something very similar when it comes to Tolstoy, which is to English him. This is very much something that would start a Trollope novel. And that isn't what Tolstoy's actually like. So the substance, you have to wonder, certainly there's so much similarity between those two, that you have to conclude that these translators aren't, so to speak, making stuff up. There's so much similarity that you start to triangulate on basically what might be there. But let's move on. Let's look at a couple more. For instance, let's go to the Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition of War and Peace with the deckled edges and the French flaps. And this is, despite the fact that it's Penguin, this is a different translation. This is Asa Briggs. So let's move on to his first chapter. And again, we do not start with any French. Well, Prince, Genoa and Lucca are now nothing more than estates taken over by the Bonaparte family. No, I give you fair warning. If you won't say this means war, if you will allow yourself to condone all the ghastly atrocities perpetrated by that Antichrist, yes, that's what I think he is, I shall disown you. You are no friend of mine, not the faithful slave you claim to be. But how are you? How are you keeping? I can see that I'm intimidating. You do sit down and talk to me. These words were spoken in French one evening in July of 1805 by the well-known Anna Pavlovna Scherer, maid of honor and confidant to the Empress Maria Fyodorovna, as she welcomed the first person to arrive at her soirée, Prince Vasily Kuragin. Prince Vasily has a name. He didn't in those two other translations, but he does now. Kuragin. Kuragin. A man of high rank and esteem, or influence. Anna Pavlovna had had a cough for the last few days, and she called it la grippe. Grippe being a new word not yet in common currency. A footman of hers in scarlet livery had gone round that morning delivering notes written in French, each saying precisely the same thing. If you have nothing better to do, Count or Prince, and if the prospect of spending an evening with a poor sick lady is not too unnerving, I shall be delighted to see you at my residence between 7 and 10. Signed, Annette Scherer. My goodness, what a violent attack, replied the prince, who had only just come in and was not in the least put out by this welcome. Dressed in his embroidered court uniform, with knee breeches, shoes, and stars across his chest, he looked at her with a flat face of undisturbed serenity. His French was the elegant tongue of our grandparents, who used it for thought as well as speech, and it carried the soft tones of condescension that come naturally to an eminent personage grown old in high society and at court. He came up to Anna Pavlovna and kissed her hand, and presenting her his perfumed and glistening bald pate, then seated himself calmly on the sofa. First things first, he said, how are you, my dear friend? Put my mind at rest. His voice remained steady, and his tone, for all its courtesy and sympathy, implied indifference and even gentle mockery. How can one feel well when one is suffering in a moral sense? How can any sensitive person find peace of mind nowadays? Said Anna Pavlovna. I do hope you're staying all evening. Well, there is that reception at the French ambassador's. It's Wednesday. I must show my face, said the prince. My daughter is coming to take me there. I thought tonight's festivities had been cancelled. I must say all these celebrations and fireworks are becoming rather tedious. If they had known you wanted to cancel it, the celebration cancelled, it would have been, said the prince, with the predictability of a wound-up clock. Sheer habit made him say things he didn't even mean. Notice there's something missing there. Right? There's a lot missing there. This is a far more telegraphic translation. We were told in the last two translations that he not only doesn't believe it, but he doesn't want it to be believed. There's stuff being sheared away here. Or maybe stuff was added in those earlier ones. These are all things you have to think about when you're weighing all these things side by side. Stop teasing me. Come, tell me what's been decided in the O'Brien dispatch. You know everything. What is there to tell? Replied the prince in a cold, bored tone. What's been decided? They've decided that Bonaparte has burnt his boats, and I rather think we're getting ready to burn ours. So, like I mentioned, that is a more telegraphic translation. Maybe that's more to your taste. Maybe that suits you better. There's a lot less of the vaguely Edwardian padding. Some of you love Edwardian padding. God knows I do. The Rosemary Edmonds translation is my favorite English language translation of this, but some of you don't. Some of you distrust it. Let's go on to the last really popular translation of War and Peace. We haven't done the mods, but we'll do the last really popular one because we don't want this to go on forever. Bookshelf Essentials are not supposed to go on forever. This is the Pevear and Volokhonsky translation. Faded everywhere, amazingly popular. Let's see what they do with part one. They are known for being unconventional translators. As unconventional as you can be and still get a contract with Viking and still want to be popular in bookstores. And here, I'm not going to subject you to it, but here I want to show you something. They don't translate the French at all. That whole opening greeting about Genoa and Lucca being family estates of the Bonapartes, that whole opening greeting by Anna Scherer is in French, with the translation at the bottom. And her invitation is also in French, with a translation at the bottom. So we're going to read the translations, but I want to come back to that when we're done. We're going to just stick to the English because, like I said, most of the people who are reading this are probably monoglot English readers. So we have to go all the way past the greeting. The whole opening paragraph of this book is a dialogue. We have to go past that to the second paragraph. So spoke, in July 1805, the renowned Anna Pavlovna Scherer, maid of honor and intimate of the Empress Maria Feodorovna, greeting the important and high-ranking Prince Vasily, the first to arrive at her soiree. Anna Pavlovna had been coughing for several days. She had the grip, as she put it. Grip was a new word then, used only by rare people. So not used rarely, and only by a few people, but used by rare people. Little notes had been sent out that morning with a red liveried footman, and on all of them, without distinction, there was written, and then the translation of the invitation is, if you have nothing better to do, Count or Prince, and if the prospect of spending the evening with a poor sick woman does not frighten you too much, I should be delighted to see you here between 7 and 10. And the prince responds to her in French. He opens out in French, which is translated here as, God, what a virulent outburst. The entering prince replied, not ruffled in the least by such a reception. He was wearing an embroidered court uniform, stockings and shoes and stars that had a bright expression on his flat face. He spoke that refined French in which our grandparents not only spoke but thought, and with those quiet, patronizing intonations which are proper to a significant man who has grown old in society and at court. He went over to Anna Pavlovna, kissed her hand, presenting her with his perfumed, shining bald pate, and settled comfortably on the sofa. So we have two pates now. And then he says more French, which you have to go down to the bottom of the page to get translated. Before all, tell me how you're doing, my dear friend. Then back up, because then it shifts back to English. Set me at ease, he said, without changing his voice or tone in which, though through propriety and sympathy, one could discern indifference and even mockery. How can one be well when one suffers morally? Is it possible to remain at ease in our time if one has any feeling? Said Anna Pavlovna. You stay the whole evening, I hope? And the fete at the British ambassador's? Today is Wednesday. I must put in an appearance, said the prince. My daughter will come to fetch me and take me there. I thought today's fete was cancelled. And then French. You have to go down to the bottom of the page. I confess to you that all these fetes and all the fireworks are beginning to become insipid. Then back up. If they had known that you wished it, the fete would have been cancelled, said the prince, uttering out of habit, like a wound-up clock, things that he did not even wish people to believe. Then French. We move back down to the bottom of the page. Don't torment me. Well, what has been decided in connection with the O'Brien dispatch? You know everything. Then back up to the page. What can I tell you? Said the prince in a cold, bored tone. Then more French, down to the bottom of the page. What has been decided? It has been decided that Bonaparte has burned his boats, and I believe that we are in the process of burning ours. Prince Vasily also spoke lazily, the way an actor speaks a role in an old play. Anna Pavlovna Scherer, on the contrary, despite her 40 years, was brimming with animation and impulses. Being an enthusiast had become her social position, and she sometimes became enthusiastic even when she had not wished to, so as not to deceive the expectations of people who knew her. The restrained smile that constantly played on Anna Pavlovna's face, though it did not suit her outworn features, expressed, as it does in spoiled children, a constant awareness of her dear shortcoming, in which she did not wish, could not, and found no need to correct. I know that this is an immensely popular translation, but if you are an English monoglot reader, that is going to be a jarring way to read. Constantly going down to the footnotes on every page, sometimes in the middle of a sentence, where a character is saying two sentences in the same paragraph. The first part is in French, and the second part is in English. So you got to go down to the bottom of the page and read the translation of the first part of the sentence, then back up to read the English of the second part. I think it was done, at least in part, to get attention. It certainly did that. This was reviewed everywhere. God, this is covered in reviews. The Washington Post, New Yorker, the biggest reviewers of their day, reviewed this and praised it. I don't think there were any negative notes from any major venue. And maybe that appeals to you. And if it does, the reason it will is because some people, I'm not saying they're wrong, there are two types of people who read works in translation. The one wants the Edwardian padding. The one wants the translator to make this thing understandable, domesticate it, make it understandable to me so that I can read it. I can read your version of it and maybe end up loving it. The other school of translation, and also the other body of translation readers, wants just the opposite of that. No, don't do that. I want to feel that I'm reading something strange. I want to feel that I'm reading something that is not part of my world. I don't want Edwardian padding unless it's in the original. I want you to echo the original as accurately as your target language will allow. Neither one of those is wrong. It's just a question of what you like. And which is why I always suggest line up your translations and figure out what you like. Don't figure out what somebody else wants you to like. Figure out what you like. Do you like feeling like you are in the presence of something strange? In other words, do you want to read In Search of Lost Time? Or do you want to read Remembrance of Things Past? Which is it? Do you want to read something that reads weird? Or something that is going out of its way to read like Trollope, or to read like an English novel, to read like something that you are familiar with? It's totally up to you which you want to do. I myself, in books that are translated from languages that I can't read, I always prefer the domesticated version. I always prefer to get my foot in the door, learn the work first, learn to love the work first, and then explore all the different options that are out there. And sometimes those different options really do appeal to me. Sometimes once I've got that solid footing, that foundation, I want as strange a translation as possible, just to see. Because I feel already like I love the work, which is paradoxical because in these cases I do not know the work. I have not read the work. I've only read translations of it. But nevertheless, I prefer that. And certainly when I have taught works in translations of works that I can't read in the original, I always go for that. I've always gone for that in the past. Better to hook the reader and then get them to explore than to present them with, I don't even know what that was, some sort of babble at the UN General Assembly. I'm better to do that. I've always been of the utilitarian, the very commonplace opinion that if you don't hook the reader, none of the rest of it matters. Because they're not going to be there. But you might be different. You might want your translation to feel a little strange. So which of those did you like? This is the kind of choice that comes when you do a Bookshelf Essentials, bet you thought I forgot, about a book that you have never read. I've only read this book in translation. And maybe that's true for you too. What did you think of those four? But anyway, this has gone on way too long. I will not do another 40-minute Bookshelf Essentials ever. Not ever. And I will try my next Bookshelf Essential will not be a work in translation, so we don't have to go through this again. So I will wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.